I'll try and get into this issue of emotions in environmental ethics. And as Raisa was saying, I have specialized partly in animal philosophy, but I also do moral psychology, and that's my most recent focus in my research. And for the last 3 years or so, I have studied various moral emotions, and particularly empathy. And I had a finished book come out this autumn with Sami Keto, who will be here tomorrow. And I have some of the books with me if anybody wants to buy a book on empathy. And it popularizes empathy sciences and studies of how empathy affects our moral agency and societal networking and so on. So, and an English version of that will come out in February by Roman and Littlefield, and that one will focus on animals. So it's about moral agency, moral psychology, empathy, varieties of empathy, and non-human animals. But I also specialize partly in environmental ethics, and this presentation is based on a paper. I'm still kind of muddled with my words. It's based on a paper that has already been published in Ethics, Place and the Environment, and it studied the experiences people have in a wilderness setting. But this presentation will move from that onto also empathy. And this is an ongoing project. Now I'm working on a book on various other moral emotions than empathy, and I'm looking into also environmental issues in that book. So I'll be very grateful for any comments that you might have. And yes, I'll be looking into empathy and elevation in wilderness experiences and how this involves ethics. The standard way of doing environmental ethics and politics is focused on rational or scientific analysis and argumentation. When I first started studying environmental ethics, I was astounded by how rationalistic it was and how pedantically analytical it can be, and thereby something that fails to persuade people. This might be one reason why climate change is not taken seriously into account in public media or popular culture. Arguments concerning it tend to be very much focused on the use of reason. The persuasive level remains missing. A neuropsychologist called Lisa Feldman-Barré, who studies emotions, has also looked into how climate change is being ignored in mainstream media. And her argument is that as long as reports concerning environmental issues do not touch us on an emotive level, they also will not be persuasive. People will marginalize those issues. They do not touch them. And this is from a very empirical point of view. She's a neuroscientist. So this is not a soft sentimentalist approach to issues. This is something that we really have to seriously take into account. And of course, sciences have recently undergone a shift from a rationalistic understanding of humanity into what is called an affective turn. More and more, the capacity to experience and to have effect is being taken into account all across sciences. The affective human being, a human being who is not dictated only by the use of reason or language, but also her capacity to experience and have emotions, is considered finally also seriously. And I think that ecological and environmental work needs to acknowledge this too. The affective turn needs to really be incorporated into talking about climate change, whether that is in arts or other forms of human endeavor, including the sciences. We must refer to experience and emotion. So the question then is, are wilderness experiences necessary for environmental concern? Do we need to have experiences of nature in order to see value in it? Now I'll first look into the role of empathy. And I'll do this via detouring through two different, very famous environmental ethics, theories of environmental philosophy. And the first of these is deep ecology. Deep ecology is famed for arguing that instead of having a moral theory, we need to start from ontology. We need to understand our relation to other natural entities and systems before we can understand their value. We cannot begin with moral arguments, we must begin with ontology. According to them, also experiences play a role here. We are to have ontological epiphanies of our place in the wider natural environment, and this in itself is argued to lead into ethics. So we need no moral theory at all in the end. All that we need is ontological realizations and epiphanies, which again will lead into perceiving intrinsic value also in the environment. Part of these epiphanies are identification with the telos of all living beings, a telos here referring to the inner nature or function. Deep ecologists such as Arne Naess have maintained that we can broaden our sense of self to cover all of nature. We can identify with the fact that forests are striving towards certain goals, and that squirrels or rivers or even the climate can have a function and a sense of flourishing. We can identify with the fact that they too deserve to flourish. And this identification with everything that exists will lead into what they call an ecological self. And I'll soon say how this, of course, relates to empathy. One instance of such deep ecologists who talk about ontological epiphanies is Warwick Fox, who speaks of transpersonal ecology. Here again, identification is central. He maintains that we usually are stuck on the level of personal identification, where we feel attachment to only those beings who are proximate to us. We feel affection for various individuals surrounding us, and we stay with this. We broaden our identification to cover only our loved ones or work fellows or whoever happens to be in our proximity. For Fox, this is egoism. This is something based on just seek value and identifying only with those who are closest to us. Everything starts from the self. The second level is ontological identification, where we broaden this process of identifying to all that exists. Here we become aware of the astonishing fact that things are. The environment, Fox describes how the environment emerges from the background onto the foreground, and the human ego becomes utterly secondary. Her affections or personal ties no longer appear as relevant. Nature or the broader environmental entities and processes become the primary focus of attention. And here he uses quite mystical language, also akin to Zen Buddhist realizations or the Zen Buddhist tradition. We truly identify with everything. And last, there is cosmological identification, wherein we completely lose our sense of self as it exists in the egoistic paradigm. We recognize that we are part of a greater whole, or what Fox calls a single unfolding reality, and we take the viewpoint of that reality. We no longer perceive things from our own perspective only, but broaden that perspective to cover the whole of cosmos. And this in itself, this process of identification leads to an ethic of care. And the argument is that experiencing oneself as connected to the environment suffices for normative regard. We are to simply go with this very intense and demanding process of identifying with everything that exists, and ethics will follow. Now, empathy is relevant here because identification is, of course, a part of empathy. It is a form of empathy. And the particular form of empathy that it is projective empathy. Projective empathy refers to imagining oneself as the other. And this is what deep ecology ultimately is founded on. We are to imagine ourselves as the broader environment and ultimately the whole of cosmos. Therefore, empathy stands at the core of deep ecology, and I think this is not mentioned often enough. One is to expand oneself to cover the natural world via empathy. Now, these may sound like really fantastical ideas, but they have been heavily criticized. Ecofeminism is the other environmental philosophy or school of environmental philosophy which I shall mention, and they have been exceedingly critical of deep ecology. They argue that their use of identification and therefore empathy is politically worrisome. There are political issues that plague the use of empathy in regard to natural environments. The first reason for such criticism stems from the fact that the deep ecology project seems to be based on humanistic enlightenment. It focuses on the individual and her mental development as the focal point or the core unit of ethics. This, for ecofeminists, abandons the societal setting in which all ethics should take place. It prioritizes in the liberalist ethos the individual and her cultivation into something akin to the ecological self. And thereby it fails to take notice of the fact that we are not individual human beings only, but also exist in a wider societal setting, and that minds therefore interrelate and intertwine. The second source of criticism is anthropocentrism. The ecofeminists argue that here the human ego is made to cover all forms of existence. So whereas the deep ecologists think that they have a very noble endeavor at their hands of taking all life, all organic existence and ultimately all that exists into account, the ecofeminists claim that this only makes everything echo the human mind. We broaden our sense of self and swallow up nature. Non-human subjectivity appears as irrelevant. And the third form of criticism is the claim that here the ideal of a universal, disembodied and abstract knower emerges as central. This reflects a masculine identity, a masculine form of defining what knowledge and ethics are. We are to centralize universalism, loss of a subjective viewpoint into things, loss of contextuality, loss of even the body, and become the abstract, all-knowing creature who has no particularity or specificity. Therefore, they argue that deep ecologists are in fact deeply masculinistic. Now, one example of such ecofeminists is Marty Keel, who has written an excellent book called Nature Ethics, in which she criticizes deep ecology for this reason. She argues that ethics of care cannot stem from abstract metaphysics. We do not start to care about things as soon as we, on an abstract level, identify with the whole of existence. Something more is required. And deep ecology, according to her, fails to explain how on earth an ontological or cosmological awareness in itself would suffice. Ness argues that care flows naturally after the ontological epiphany. But according to Keel, there are no reasons to think so. One can, on an abstract level, understand that one is a part of the whole of cosmos, but still fail to see any moral significance in that cosmos. And Keel also argues that there is a need to critically recognize the cultural context of environmental ethics, the historical paradigms that influence the doing of academic environmental ethics. Here, liberalism and patriarchy are two dimensions or influences that clearly impact usually the male philosopher in his workroom studying environmental issues. Another ecofeminist who has criticized deep ecology and done so more famously is Val Plumwood. According to her, deep ecology takes part in colonializing the environment. Nature is incorporated into the human self. So the process of empathy, the process of identification, is in fact an act of taking power over the environment. At the same time, it fails to notice the need to recognize difference and distinctness in nature. Not everything is the same. I am not a tree. The tree is not me. The tree is very different from a human being. And according to Plumwood, as long as we do not note this utter difference of various natural entities, we cannot have genuine moral regard for them. So in this context, empathy does not have place. And furthermore, there is a need for ethics of attachment rather than detachment. As I stated, Fox argues that we are to leave the level of personal attachment and go towards broadening our epistemology to cover everything. But for Plumwood, this is a mistake because we are creatures who do feel attachment, and we cannot make that into something secondary or wholly irrelevant. We need to take attachment into account. So, the ecofeminists critique the possibility of positioning empathy as the core unit of environmental concern. For them, empathy is a tool of power. It replaces others with the self. But what needs to be noted is that this applies only to projective empathy. As I stated, the form of empathy that deep ecologists refer to comes very close or is akin to projective empathy, which is only one variety of empathic identification. There are other options, such as simulative empathy, which could perhaps be a more fruitful candidate for environmental ethics. Here, one imaginatively simulates the distinctness of others, whilst remembering that the other cannot be fully known. Simulative empathy refers to trying to use imagination in a way that makes us think of how it could be for such and such an entity. But at the same time, it takes into account the fact that we cannot fully know anything, and that there are loads of entities and creatures who do not have an actual felt, experienced viewpoint, and that therefore the use of empathy can also be wholly metaphorical. Simulative empathy appears to be a candidate for a more productive use of empathy in environmental ethics, and the ecofeminist critique does not extend to it. So the ecofeminists are too quick to say that all forms of identification and empathy are irrelevant in the context of the environment. They talk of empathy in the context of personal attachments, but this is another matter. They do not want to broaden it to concern the whole of nature. And there might be more room for thought here. Perhaps simulative empathy is a more productive way of empathizing or identifying with natural entities. Now, to move from empathy onto other moral emotions, the alternative that ecofeminists offer are awe and wonder. For them, experiences of wilderness are equally important as for deep ecologists. Ecofeminists centralize emotion and the fact that we ought to entangle ourselves with environmental entities and places, such as wilderness. But their claim is that experiencing one's place in nature ought to be contextual and narrative, and that we ought to constantly focus on what am I as a creature in relation to these other creatures? Where do I come from? Where do they come from? And what sorts of politics impact my way of understanding them? That was strange. And as I said, for them, concepts such as awe and wonder, maybe it was nature trying to come in, I don't know. Come in? Nothing. So concepts such as awe and wonder are pivotal for them. Now, to step away from ecofeminists, I don't want this to be just about two different environmental ethics theories. I'm going to just take the notion of awe and wonder and look at those without reference to ecofeminism anymore. So ecofeminism and deep ecology were relevant to empathy, and now I'm going to move into awe and wonder as forms of elevation. Ludwig Wittgenstein was famous for using the term subspecie aeternitatis, which he got from Spinoza's philosophy. It refers to the idea of being under the category of eternity. For Spinoza, it meant being part of a larger whole wherein one suddenly notices universal truths via the combination of knowledge and joy. For Wittgenstein, the idea of subspecie aeternitatis, however, comes close to something of a mystical experience. He argues that it leads to a holistic perspective into things, one that one cannot quite capture with language, and which is facilitated, for instance, by the notion of a good life or arts. In various places, he refers to it as something that leads to a sense of bewilderment at the world, and therefore it could be seen as a source of awe or wonder. We suddenly notice that we are part of something and gain a more holistic perspective, which then sparks a sense of bewilderment. How is it that we exist and that we are these sorts of beings? So here, Wittgenstein has a surprising entwinement between his very language-orientated philosophy and a holistic view and mystic wonder. There are some quotes here from him. The good life is the world seen sub specie aeternitatis. This sort of holistic view of things leads to a good life. To view the world sub specie aeterni is to view it as a whole, a limited whole. Feeling the world as a limited whole, it is this that is mystical. Not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. And this last question is very central and important for environmental ethics, in my opinion. We ought to marvel at the fact that we are here, this planet exists. If you truly stop for a moment from yourself, we are all usually quite self-directed epistemology, and just take a pause and think, how on earth can it be we are here and we are these sorts of creatures, surrounded by all these other almost alien life forms, that there is a planet? This ought to preoccupy us on an experiential level. For Wittgenstein, these are mystical experiences, but perhaps they are not so mystical after all. Perhaps we can understand them. And I'm going to try and understand them via reference to various cultural eras that have made use of wilderness experiences as elevating and as full of awe and wonder. The 18th century romantics, such as William Wordsworth and Percy Shelley, and the 19th century nature writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Thoreau, and John Moore, all had a very holistic and mystical and transcendental image of nature. Nature is something that is larger than us. It surrounds us, and we are very little in its depths. It transcends human civilization and mindedness. We are only one tiny aspect of its mystic, very peculiar existence. Here the centrality of awe and wonder are obvious. Thoreau interestingly argued that identification and empathy are the wrong starting point for environmental ethics. He maintained, and I quote here, "Compassion is a very untenable ground," because there is a lot in nature where compassion is actually something that does not seem to fit. It is hard to feel compassion when you see lions ripping antelopes into pieces. True. But awe and wonder could be more fruitful in this context. Wordsworth, I have two quotes here. Wordsworth talks of nature and our position in its larger context in the following: "Come forth into the light of things. Let nature be your teacher. One impulse from a vernal wood will teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can." And here's a quote from Thoreau: "At the same time that we are earnest to explore and learn all things, we require that all things be mysterious and unexplorable, that land and sea be infinitely wild, unsurveyed and unfathomed by us, because unfathomable. We can never have enough of nature." And in particularly this last quote, the sense of awe is obvious. Thoreau is wondering how we could ever know nature. We cannot. It is unfathomable, and precisely because of this, it sparks moral regard. And I'll quickly say of this, "We can never have enough of nature" appears to imply that perhaps we ought to have more wilderness experiences. This, of course, for Thoreau in his book Walden was central. And another nature author, John Muir, also claims that one ought to venture into the wild in order to have moral epiphanies. And here it is not identification with all that exists that is central, but rather precisely the unfathomability of natural things. Combined with limited knowledge, we can know certain things, which is intriguing. So we combine a sense of knowing something with knowledge of the fact that most will remain beyond our reach. And this draws us into nature. Wilderness is a good place to go. There is interestingly some contemporary psychological research that has explored wilderness experiences. These have been carried out by social psychologists, so psychologists in general, or other academics, trying to understand what happens when people are brought into wild surroundings. And I use here the term wilderness without going into the endless debate of whether we have wild places at all, or whether wilderness is a concept that applies in this contemporary era anymore. I'm presuming there's wilderness, if we understand wilderness to be a place that is not wholly made by human beings. And in these forms of research, people are brought into excursions. They they might go kayaking for 2 weeks, or they might go hiking up mountains for 2 weeks. Usually the rule is that they are not meant to speak, they are not meant to use language, they are to remain silent, and only afterwards contemplate on what happened to them, or during the study write down what they are experiencing. But the important thing here is that they are leaving the social cacophony that constantly surrounds us behind for a moment and simply venturing into the wild. What happens to such individuals is interesting. Wilderness experiences usually enable reflection, clarity, feelings of authenticity, transcendental experiences, and epiphanies of holistic ontologies. These sound like very majestic words, but they are repeated all over and over again in the reports written by those who took part in these studies. They claim that being in a wilderness setting enables them to reflect more lucidly on various things, amongst others their own place in nature. They also gain a sense of clarity. Things seem to appear more illuminated for them. Also feelings of authenticity, of being somewhere that is not wholly artificial. Feeling more rooted is central to such experiences, as are transcendental feelings, feelings of being only small amidst something much larger, which again leads to epiphanies of holistic ontologies. The studied individuals have reported, for instance, the following. I could truly see for the first time. I felt as if I had lifted my head above the water and suddenly saw a new world. I could have listed loads of quotes that are quite emotive and quite filled with these sorts of notions of finally realizing one's position in nature. Epiphanies are central to them. But also awe and wonder are key features of such experiences. Many of those studied report feeling intense emotions related to awe and wonder and bewilderment. People suddenly stop and pause and see things anew. What usually is mundane and perhaps bland and boring, like a tree, can suddenly be unfathomable, bewildering, something that truly deserves to be looked at. And this, of course, can happen to anybody who ventures into forests or rivers or even the city park. If we, for a moment, leave aside our constant babble in our minds, the constant self-directed babble, what am I going to eat? What am I going to eat in the evening? What should I do tomorrow at work? Whom should I email? If we leave this aside for a while, something new might emerge. And this again may lead to awe, wonder, and importantly, a motivation for moral change. In these studies, significantly, many of those who reported ontological epiphanies also altered their lifestyles. They altered their way of perceiving environment and its value, and they took natural entities more into account. They changed morally, and this shows the strength of certain key moral emotions. Awe and wonder may be very, very productive in producing moral change. But how to understand such experiences theoretically? We could just follow Wittgenstein and say that they are very mystical. What can we see? We should just remain silent, which is sometimes a very good option. But in order to truly understand what sorts of emotions we should invite in people, in order for them to change their understanding of natural values or environmental values, perhaps a little more exploration into the nature of such experiences is needed. One possible alternative comes from William James, who famously talked of religious experiences. In such experiences, one has a sudden feeling of knowing reality. Epiphanies, again, are central. Suddenly everything changes and one feels illuminated with knowledge, new sort of knowledge. P.S. Stevens has brought this idea from James into environmental philosophy and claims, oh, I've misspelled it there, religious experience or religious experience, if read secularly, is the most fluent way to understand wilderness experiences. Stevens has analyzed how religious experiences can be made secular and understood simply as a silent experience where we undergo a sudden epistemic shift. According to him, what is required here is that wilderness is not approached instrumentally. As soon as we go into the forest looking for something, and I hate to say this because I know there are berry pickers here, being it is, as it is that we are in Finland, or perhaps even hunters, most people, when they go into the wild, they want something out of it. They go and search for something. Stevens argues that this does not form a particularly fertile ground for these sorts of epiphanies or epistemic shifts, because it reproduces the idea that nature is there as a resource, as something that ought to always be approached instrumentally. We begin to only see those things which are of use to us, and fail to see the completely irrelevant things, instrumentally irrelevant things, that might actually have huge moral importance. So the trick is to go into the wild without looking for anything, and simply remain silent. What comes to mind here is, even though I've not written it down, is philosophy of Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil, which talks of attentiveness as an important moral tool. In a state of attentiveness, one drops instrumentalizing viewpoints and seeks to simply be present to various entities, objects, or beings. And one could argue, as I did in the paper that I mentioned, that wilderness experiences take part in attentiveness. One does not look for anything, but simply is. And this can lead to strong epiphanies. Another way of explaining such experiences comes from Abraham Maslow, whose social psychology is often still used, and which includes various problems and difficulties. But his notion of peak experience is interesting here. According to Maslow, in a state of peak experience, we have a sudden holistic recognition of reality, which leads to joy, wonder, and moral respect. Again, the same idea of something ontologically bewildering and morally resonating is present. We suddenly become aware of things that we usually remain oblivious to. And this leads into ethics. Now, whereas for Stevens, what's necessary is refraining from instrumentalizing nature, for Maslow what is important is withdrawal from stereotyping thoughts. So when we venture into the wild, we are to not perceive it via stereotypical beliefs concerning it, but instead ought to simply try and not be so quite enmeshed in pre-existing judgments. Of course, we cannot be wholly objective. We are always culturally influenced, but there are degrees, there are shades, and we can move between those shades from being completely stereotypic towards being more open and fluid to alternative explanations. And Maslow suggests that we ought to avoid stereotypes. And this leads to finally noticing nature intrinsically rather than instrumentally. So in essence, whereas Stevens argues that the leaving aside of instrumentality suffices. For Maslow, we must first leave outside stereotyping beliefs. So if I look at a tree, I'm not to think of what it's composed of, what species it belongs to, or other standard definitions, but simply observe a strange tree. Or if I see a bird, simply observe the odd creature in front of me without resorting to biological explanations or scientific definitions, or instrumentalizing stereotypes such as, oh, there's a good thing to burn in my stove, or for those who eat meat, to eat a good thing to eat when seeing a bird. Stereotypes are to set aside. Interestingly, for both James and for Maslow, these sorts of experiences are typical in wilderness. James argues that religious experiences are most frequent in a wilderness setting, and he himself was an avid goer into the wild. He hiked and loved nature. And Maslow similarly argues that his peak experience is optimal in the wild. However, again, there are also problems. Also, religious and peak experiences can repeat notion of humanistic enlightenment. Maslow talks of self-actualization when he refers to peak experience, which manifests the idea or the strength of the idea that it is the individual who is to cultivate herself to maximum potential. And this, of course, is a very liberalistic understanding. These forms of experiences can become very humanistic, based on the sole effort to cultivate and refine oneself. And if this happens, the nature in itself might be left aside unduly. Experiences may become prioritized at the cost of ethics. This is another related problem. We may suddenly begin to look for wilderness experiences as a source of hedonistic enjoyment or aesthetics. If one prioritizes having such experiences, they become the instrumentalized feature of environment. Paradoxically, looking for experiences from nature instrumentalizes the nature. So what was meant to enable for us to perceive intrinsic value in, say, a forest, actually leads into instrumentalizing that forest. And this is something that Maslow himself recognizes. He claims that if we focus only on subjective experience, we may forget about the world. We may become ignorant of the political and moral issues, the practical issues regarding the environment. We may become hedonistically eager to enjoy nature whilst overlooking climate change and other uncomfortable political issues. So there are dangers involved with these sorts of experiences that spark awe and wonder. Also, wonder and awe may be colored by humanistic and egoistic politics. Now, I propose a solution. First of all, one ought to notice that affect or emotion and reason ought to be intertwined. We cannot simply flow with the emotion and think that that in itself suffices. I think this is the mistake that a lot of moral psychology, which centralizes emotion, makes. Whilst talking of emotion, we may ignore the relevance of reasoned reflection. It ought to always be combined intentionally with emotion. Of course, reason and emotion do structurally always follow each other, but there are differences in how much weight, intentional weight, we give to them. And sometimes it is very, very significant that we remember to also reflect on what is happening when we have emotions. So therefore, in a wilderness context, when we are undergoing wilderness experiences and feeling awe and wonder, or identification with the whole of the world, we should also intellectually reflect on what is happening to the environment. Why do we perceive it in the way that we do? Where do our beliefs concerning its values stem from? And where do we want to aim? Where are we going? Reasoned analysis ought to be intertwined with wonder, awe, and identification. Emotion in itself does not suffice. There is also a related need to pay attention to the contextual politics of emotions and experiences. They are never neutral. Not even bewilderment or epiphanies are neutral. They are always culturally and politically affected. For a long time, I wanted to believe that wilderness experiences are somehow neutral or objective, that one gains a direct access to things as they are, the famous Kantian das Ding an sich. And I love going into the wild. I do that daily if I can. But I have noticed that also, of course, my deep emotions or epiphanies are impacted by my social surrounding. They are made by me in the end. And what is made by me is made also by the influences that surround me. My emotions are not neutral. So this is another important reason for critically evaluating and reflecting on where our motivations and emotions come from. Where does my motivation for going into the wild stem from? And how do cultural beliefs color what I experience? I apologize for the slight typos there. So therefore, we ought to use also reasoned reflection and political awareness when engaging with such deeply morally influential emotions as identification, empathy, wonder, or awe. And this is the last slide. This leads us back to empathy. In my book, or in Sami's and mine book, I have talked of reflective empathy as one form of empathy that ought to be more talked of, or ought to be more socially supported and even enforced. Reflective empathy has two levels. It does not only stay on the first level of thought and emotion, where usually empathy lies. Usually when we empathize, we, for instance, resonate, and it happens on the first level. We deeply feel in that moment. But reflective empathy goes to the epistemological second-order level, where we can evaluate our first-order experiences or thoughts. It makes use of Iris Murdoch's and Simone Weil's attentiveness, but also rational reflection. And here we constantly critically evaluate what beliefs and emotions in me impact my capacity to empathize, and how do they impact with whom I empathize. So reflective empathy involves contextual and political awareness, as also rational analysis to a certain extent. It makes use of knowledge. And the beneficial side of it is that it also allows us to change. Usually empathy is seen as something that involves helping the other, but reflective empathy helps ourselves to change and alter our background beliefs, stereotypes, cultural dogma, or emotions which hinder empathic processes. Therefore, reflective empathy is a matter of moral cultivation. And I think that it could be combined with awe and wonder very, very fluently. We could feel bewilderment at the unfathomable, peculiar, even alien existence of trees and moss and rocks and rivers. We could do this by reflecting on where our emotions come from, and how might I expand my sense of empathy or identification or awe and wonder towards a direction where it covers more and more creatures and entities. So reflective empathy can enhance awe and wonder, and thereby lead into environmental ethical experiences. And I recommend everybody go and touch a tree soon enough after this day. Thank you, that was it.